Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. On Thursday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the rate of unionization in the United States was the lowest on record. In the overall workforce, the percentage of people in a union is now 10.1% in 2022 from 10.3% the year earlier. And Monet, that is a small annual slide. But this is the trend we've been seeing for years now, and it really adds up. If you look again at the overall workforce, 2 decades ago, 2002, it was 13.3% unionized. Now, again, just to repeat the number for 2022, it's 10.1%. And Monet, I wonder what you make of that as a reflection on changing trends in the workforce and the economy writ large.
Yeah, it's an interesting trend because I think that labor activists and their supporters have obviously acknowledged that there's been a decade-long decline in unionization, particularly in the private sector. But a lot of people seem to think that the trend was beginning to reverse a little bit during the COVID era. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that job openings had really exploded. We'd seen more than 11 million job openings. I believe it's down now around 10 million still. And that gave a lot of leverage to workers. And so a lot of workers were thinking about ways that they could extract higher pay out of their employers, and unions have pitched themselves as a traditionally viable vehicle to extract those kinds of concessions. In addition to that, you have inflation, and that sort of created the urgency around finding ways to increase pay to keep up with the increasing cost of living. And so you put those two things together, and there was a narrative that unions were again on the march, and you had high-profile unionization battles at Amazon and Starbucks. But in the end, it seems as if this was mostly illusory and mostly short-term. Yes, there might be some high-profile unionization pushes, but generally it seems that workers who are changing jobs more tend to think that it's not worth paying $500 a year in dues to potentially increase their wages in a job that they're not going to stay in for very long. And we have seen an increase in job switching. So I would expect that that's one reason why there wasn't a sustained increase in the number of people seeking unionization.
To underline what Monet said, the prototypical union member for a long time now has not been what you think of as, a steel worker in a hard hat. Private workforce is now only 6% unionized. It's mostly government workers and teachers. But remarkably, those numbers are falling too. 33.1% of public workers are now unionized. That's down from 2 decades ago, 37.3%. So a drop of more than 4 points. And Kim, again, I think that some of this has to do with the broader trends in the workforce. Some of it, though, I think is better public policy. We have states that are enacting right to work laws. You have the Supreme Court's ruling in the Janus decision a few years ago that allowed public workers to be out of a union and not build these so-called fair share fees. You have a huge growth in charter schools. About 7.5% of America's kids are now in charter schools, and most of those schools, a very high percentage of them, are non-union, which is what gives them the flexibility to attract parents and families in the first place. And so, Kim, I think some of this has to do with the trends in the workforce, but some of it is victories on public policy for Republicans who want freedom in the workforce and workers who don't like their union that they've been forced to be in for those many years and really want out.
Couldn't agree more. We now have 28 right-to-work states, and the trend continues largely in that favor. In fact, just in the 2022 midterms, we had Tennessee, actually the voters in that state vote to constitutionally protect their right-to-work laws so that it couldn't be dismantled easily. As you note, there's also been good court precedent that have tried to stop in its tracks some of the games that unions play in trying to pull people into unions who don't necessarily want to be in unions. For instance, home health care workers, that's been a big area they have targeted in recent years. We've also had public sector reforms. You look back at Wisconsin and Scott Walker and the efforts he made there to engage in public sector union reforms. And it turns out that a lot of even government workers, if given the option, would prefer not to be paying those union dues and not to be subject to union rules. And look, I think this gets a little bit more to attitudes, especially younger generation workers, as Monet was talking about, who do not see the benefits that union can provide them. In fact, see more of a straitjacket in terms of their ability to succeed and move up because so much of it is based on seniority. Now, if I were a union boss, I would be most concerned about those public sector union numbers falling. As you mentioned, Kyle, the private sector share has been plummeting for a long time now. And to the extent that the unions have continued to have some clout and heft, particularly in Democratic Party politics, it's because of the public sector unionization rates. But if you're beginning to see those changes at state and local governments and also simply more and more public sector workers opting out, they've got an even bigger problem on their hands.
Which isn't to say that the unions and unionization drives have had no successes. And Monet, you've covered some of these examples, the pushes in Starbucks and in Amazon, and also the efforts to reach out to people who, again, you would not traditionally think of as union employees. And Monet, the one that always comes to mind to me is the graduate student employees at universities, some of whom are organizing notably under the banner of the United Auto Workers. I think that's a fascinating juxtaposition. And Monet does suggest where the union leaders think that they can get traction and where their future growth might come from.
Yes, that's true. And I think that union membership has become more of a political affinity among certain kind of non-manufacturing, non-production workers over the past few years. So even as the numbers of people participating in unions has declined, I think there's been an embrace by a certain type of college-educated progressive of their importance. And that is what is behind, I think, the unionization of Starbucks, for example. You have a lot of these service workers, many of whom are sort of underemployed, et cetera, and want to basically take part in the labor movement. It has part to do with improving wages and benefits, but it also has a lot to do with trying to align themselves with the political movement. And I think the same goes for graduate students unionizing and a lot of these other industries. But I do think it's interesting that the unions obviously themselves are taking action to try to see where can we appeal to non-traditional workers, and then the Democratic Party, which depends on the financial support of these unions, is also trying a very broad strategy to see if there are ways that they can strengthen it. And so you see things like prevailing wage provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. You see things like the National Labor Relations Board, which regulates unionization, trying to make it easier for any given establishment to unionize. And so you have unions adapting on one hand, and then you have Democrats realizing that the trend bodes ill for them in the long run and trying to find policy ways to encourage unionization.
But I think that's a great point to end on. As Monet suggests, there are no permanent victories, and certainly not in politics. Michigan, the Democrats took over the state house in Michigan in the 2022 elections. There's already talk, Kim, of repealing potentially the right to work law there. Joe Biden always has been pushing for the PRO Act in Congress. And that's not going to get through a Republican House, but maybe if Democrats have better luck in the House races in 2024, that's an opportunity. And to the point that Monet makes about the financial backing, according to Open Secrets, unions spent more than $97 million in the 2022 elections. And of course, we know Joe Biden's wife is herself a member of one of the teachers' unions. And so I don't discount Joe Biden's genuine belief that unionizing is good for workers and good for the country. but it's hard not to note that it's also pretty good for the Democratic Party and Joe Biden.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I would agree that this is not a fight that's going anywhere anytime soon. And that those of us out there who believe in sort of more rights for workers in terms of being able to make their own choices, this is going to be a battle that people will have to be on guard for a very long time. But I would just make this one point, since you mentioned Joe Biden and the PRO Act, and Monet mentioned some of these other pieces that are being put into legislation. What we're seeing out there is that all things equal, if people are simply given a choice, they're not much interested in joining. And we've seen that in a lot of these failed unionization votes that have gone on too in recent years. And so it's very worth noting that the Democratic Party's strategy at this point, and the big unions' strategy at this point, is no longer about trying to lure people into the union movement or about reforming themselves from within in a way that might make them more attractive to newer rounds of workers, but rather to co-opt the Democratic Party with vast amounts of money to then get them to enforce unionization on workers across the country. And I think that that's a big difference. It's something that started to change in the union movement in the 1970s. Instead of trying to make themselves worthy of their members that they served, they turned more and more to politics. And that's where we are right now.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.